you believe in free will as a Christian. Would this lack of nominal Christians shape up to actually give birth to these more moralistic Christians that haven't been born into Christianity and just accepted it because their family says that they should, have discovered it themselves and worked out why they are a Christian and discovered their relationship with Jesus? Is there some sort of moral superiority to that in Christianity, working it out yourself? Or is it the same, working it out and spending 30 years doing that, being born into it and told to be a Christian by your parents?
Well, I got two kids. I very much want them to be Christians. I think it's true. I think Jesus is Lord. I think there's this unimprovable story of God, loving them to hell and back, and I want them to own that for themselves. So I want their story to be, I grew up in the midst of this, and it's been challenged in any number of ways in secular Britain, but I think it's a story that stands the test of time, and I would love if their story is I grew up in it and it's proved a solid foundation for me for the rest of my life. But my day job is to go around and persuade other people who've never grown up in Christian faith to come in. And what's different about such people is, you're exactly right, that there's this sense of you have to really own it for yourself and dive in with both feet in a way that cradle Christians haven't had to. And one of the ways I kind of describe this is, the sea of faith is often described as like a tide. And so at high tide, back in, 1851 was kind of the high watermark of church attendance in England, and half the country was in church on a Sunday, every Sunday. And the tide has gone out, since then, and we are kind of at a low tide at the moment. But tides don't always go out, and they don't only go out. Sometimes they come back. But one of the things about low tide is, at low tide, you recognize what's underneath the sea of faith, and you recognize, maybe some things that are a little bit frightening. The will to power, and just nature red in tooth and claw without Christianization. I think a lot of people are staring some of those consequences in the face and thinking that's a little bit scary. I think also at low tide, you figure out the shaping influence of the sea of faith, and you're much more likely to pick up a book like Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor, but the historian, the cool Tom Holland, the historian Tom Holland, who wrote the big fat book Dominion, about how much the sea of faith, how much Christianity has absolutely shaped us from the ground up. I think people are starting to notice that shaping influence of the sea of faith because it's low tide. They're starting to get scared about what happens when we get rid of things like human rights and that kind of thing. But what's also true about low tide is, if you ever go to Le Mont Saint-Michel, if you've gone there in France off the Brittany coast, there's this incredible monastery that's sort of built on an island that is not an island at low tide. At high tide, if it's a very high tide, you can't get across to it. There's a church on the top of it. And what I think happens at high tide, what I think happens in the 1850s is you just bob along and you find yourself in church, right? Like my kids, they've just found themselves in church because they happen to have been born into a Christian home. At low tide, if you want to get to church, you've got to make the trek yourself. You've got to make the pilgrimage. You've got to put one foot in front of the other. And so much of what I do in trying to persuade people about being Christians is, we are not in 19th century Victorian England. You're not just going to bob along and find yourself in church, but here are some steps that you can take. Have you noticed the shaping influence of Christianity? Have you noticed about human rights and equality and compassion? Do you want to pull at those threads? Because I think you might find Jesus at the other end of it. Have you also noticed what might happen if we get rid of human rights and we are just biological survival machines? You don't believe that, though, do you? And I'm finding that a lot of my secular friends, they say that this is a godless universe, but they really believe in human rights. And actually, they believe in human rights a lot more than they believe that this is a godless universe, like a lot more. And then they start taking a step towards church and taking a step towards church. And I think that's the journey that I'd love people on the outside of faith to take. And actually, low tide means that can happen more intentionally now.
So to be super clear, you have free will, you have the choice to do good or bad in the Christian teachings. If someone inherently doesn't feel a strong sense of belonging with Jesus, but then they choose to do good. Is there a moral superiority to that compared to someone that's just born into good?
I see what you're getting at. Yeah. Well, I think, choice is so interesting, isn't it? All sorts of TED Talks you can kind of look, but one's called The Paradox of Choice, and how we actually become enslaved by too much choice, and conceptualizing the human person as simply a choosing individual who could go left, could go right. That's not exactly how we operate, either like within the Bible or just within psychology and sociology. But having said all that, it is absolutely better for you to recognize the humanity of somebody else and serve the poor, no matter what you can get out of it, no matter how weak that person is, no matter whether they can elevate you or do anything for you. There is a goodness that is intrinsic and inherent in you serving that guy. Absolutely. I completely believe that.
So do you think it detracts from the goodness level, if we're to call it that, if someone's born into nominal Christianity and they make these decisions not based off of the awareness that they're serving someone else, but just because it's been, I guess the right phrase to use is programmed into them by their surroundings?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, we're constantly being programmed by our surroundings. We're constantly inhabiting a story, whether it's the Christian story or whether it's a certain secular story or whether it's a Hindu story or a Muslim story. We're constantly inhabiting a story. Usually the story is I'm the hero of some hero's journey and yay me, right? And what will actually enable you to be moral, I think, is to decenter yourself from being the hero of your own story. And that's what faith and faith traditions are trying to constantly do. Like, you're not the hero. Let me tell you about this guy who was the hero. His name is Jesus. And that sort of decenters you and then enables you, I think, more and more to look outside yourself to other people. But so are you getting at the question, is somebody, because they're not a Christian and yet they serve the poor, therefore there's a moral superiority to that?
Not even serving the poor and they're not Christian, but that they're not Christian, they maybe live a very hateful life towards other people. And then they work out why that was bad. They feel a change of heart. They both have the cerebral sense of understanding what they're doing to other people, but also they feel this change of heart. They then convert to Christianity and they live a life of good morals and serving other people. Is that not more moral than someone who's simply programmed by their childhood, by their adolescence, growing up in a Christian school?
Oh, man.
I feel like it goes back to the thing that we were talking about earlier about me being a nominal atheist. I didn't have any merit in my views as an atheist. I hadn't actually worked them out myself. It was just this zoomed in rose through which I was looking at the world in. So could you not say the same thing for these nominal Christians that are inherently good, but they didn't choose to be good?
You have basically just described Jesus' most famous story. Do you know the story of the prodigal son?
No.
So here we go. A man has two sons, an older brother and a younger brother. Younger brother does what younger brothers always do, and he's a bit of a rebel. And he says, Dad, you know that inheritance that's coming to me when you die? You seem to be taking your time. Could you either hurry up and die or give me the money now so I can take the inheritance and get as far away from you as I possibly can? So like this kid, rebel, scumbag, especially given how good this dad turns out to be in the story. Amazingly, the father says, fine, have your share of the inheritance now. The kid takes the money, runs, goes off into the far country, and squanders the wealth in wild living, right? And it's a really interesting story for the West as well. Like you can think of this at a cultural level as well as a personal level. Have we taken the goods of the Christian inheritance and kind of squandered them on self? And of course, what happens is the money runs out. The money always runs out. He ends up in a pigsty. Not a great place for a Jew to find themselves. You know, he's got a job feeding the pigs. He's so hungry he wants to eat the pig food. And then he decides, okay, I've screwed things up royally. I'm going to go back to my dad and I'm going to say, Dad, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your slaves and one of your hired men, he says. And so he kind of trudges back with this sorry spiel. The father clearly has been like checking the horizon to see whether his son will come back. He runs to his boy, throws his arms around him, puts a robe around him, puts a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. He says, "Kill the fatted calf." If you've ever heard people say that, it's from this story. "Kill the fatted calf. My son was lost and he's found. He was dead and he's alive." So they begin to celebrate. But what we've forgotten about is the second brother, the older brother. He was the stay-at-home. He never left. So we are to imagine him in the field with the shovel and, sweat on his brow. He's always been working for his dad. He hates that his father has forgiven his brother. He hates it. And he refuses to go into the party, and the father has to come out to him, and this older brother is like, "Look, all these years I've slaved for you. You never gave me even a young goat just to celebrate with my friends, but when this son of yours, comes back having squandered his wealth on prostitutes, you kill the fatted calf for him." And the father's like, "My son, you can come home anytime you want, but you've got to give up on the pride of being the self-sufficient one who's always been in the house and you've always been working. You've just come on the basis that you're just a son with your father. You're just a brother with your brother. Just come on the basis of you're invited to a meal for free. Come on that basis." And the story ends with this elder brother who's always been around the Christian stuff, and he never actually just enjoys it as a child. And the rebel son is enjoying the party. And so Jesus is telling this fascinating story. It's like it's a story of heaven and hell, but the heaven of the feast, who is at the feast? It's the younger brother who's the rebel is at the feast because he doesn't come trying to claim anything. The older brother who'd been around it the whole time, but had never understood it's just about my father's love. It's not about my earning. It's not about my morality even. It's just a free gift. I'm being invited into this feast. He is outside the feast with weeping and wailing and the angry gnashing of teeth, which is every way that Jesus describes hell. It's the most shocking story ever. And it basically says, heaven is for the immoral. But it's the immoral who come home to just take that place at the table as a beloved child. And that's what a Christian is. And I imagine the next day that son went and worked really hard in the field and did all the good stuff that you're meant to do. But it's on the basis of being invited home as a sinner who is saved, not as a moralist who has climbed to heaven.
It feels to me as though everything I'm getting from what we've discussed the last few minutes is that there is a moral superiority in feeling these compulsions but not acting on them. Is that what you'd agree with?
Moral compulsions to do what?
To do bad.
Okay, yeah. No, so yeah, don't do the bad stuff. Definitely don't do the bad stuff.
But are you more of a moral person if you have more bad compulsions that you don't act on?
Yeah,
but you don't do them.
Yeah, and that's I think that's true. There are those who are tempted towards sins that I'm never tempted towards, and if I resist that doesn't redound to my greater glory.
So in that light, could you, in theory, come up with a ranking of morality of different Christians?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. But at the end of the day, you come in on the Jesus thing not because of your morality. You come in on the Jesus thing as a wretch, as someone who I haven't earned it, but I'm offered it for free. So you come in on the Christian thing not because of your goodness, but because you've owned your badness. Jesus says, I'm a doctor for the sick. He says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. I haven't come to call righteous people, but sinners. When I go to the doctor, I don't tell the doctor everything that's right about me. There's lots of things that are right about me. But when I go to the doctor, I tell him everything is wrong with me. And that's the basis on which we come to Jesus, not claiming our goodness, but owning our badness. And then Jesus, the doctor, puts us back together and sends us out into the world, not as amazingly moral human beings, but as those who have found a measure of healing for the badness that we've accepted about ourselves. So it's not really it's not a ladder climbing. The Christian religion, the sign for the Christian religion is not a ladder. It's a cross, which is kind of the opposite.